Apologize or leave, my husband ordered as his family humiliated me during Christmas dinner. I did not argue. I packed 2 suitcases, took our 5-year-old daughter, and bought 2 one-way tickets overseas. Hours later, their phones started ringing nonstop because they finally opened the gift I left under their tree. My name is Nadia. I am 35 years old, and I am about to show you what happens when you mistake a woman's silence for weakness. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to join a community of people who understand that family betrayal cuts deeper than anything else. The crystal chandeliers in my mother-in-law, Brenda's historic Chicago brownstone, cast a warm, heavy glow over the perfectly roasted prime rib. It was Christmas evening. The massive mahogany dining table groaned under the weight of expensive silver platters, imported porcelain, and crystal wine glasses. To anyone looking through the frosted glass windows from the snowy street outside, we looked like the ultimate picture of affluent perfection. A wealthy, successful Black family enjoying the holidays together in a multi-million-dollar home. But the air inside that dining room was suffocating. I sat near the end of the table, carefully cutting a small piece of meat for my 5-year-old daughter, Aria. My phone vibrated intensely against my thigh, where I had hidden it under my linen napkin. I glanced down for a fraction of a second. It was a highly secure encrypted message from my lead analyst. The final routing numbers from the offshore shell accounts had just been verified. The numbers matched perfectly with the missing pension funds from my husband's family business. I needed exactly 1 minute to authorize the federal transfer freeze. Just one single minute to secure the evidence I had spent 5 grueling years compiling an absolute secret. I kept my phone under the table edge, typing a quick confirmation code to lock the trap into place. But Trent noticed. Trent is my husband, Julian's brother-in-law. He is a white man who married Julian's sister, Vanessa, 5 years ago. Almost immediately after the extravagant wedding, Brenda and Julian handed Trent the position of chief financial officer in their lucrative logistics firm. Trent loved to remind everyone that he came from old money while taking every conceivable opportunity to belittle my working-class background. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive bourbon, allowing the ice to clink loudly in the quiet room to draw everyone's attention. "Julian," he said, his voice carrying across the table with dripping condescension, "you really need to rein your wife in." Women from working-class neighborhoods never quite grasp the concept of legacy wealth. We are sitting here trying to enjoy a sophisticated family dinner, and she is clutching that phone like a desperate low-level clerk. It is Christmas, for heaven's sake. Tell her to put the device away before she ruins the entire aesthetic of the evening. I froze, my fingers hovering over the screen. I did not react immediately. I simply locked my phone and placed it face down on my lap. I was not a low-level clerk. I was a senior forensic accountant and risk manager who handled federal audits for major corporations. But to Trent, and to this entire family, I was just the charity case Julian had rescued from a blue-collar neighborhood on the South Side. I slowly lifted my gaze and looked across the table at Julian. We had been married for 7 years. I expected my husband, the man who had vowed to protect and honor me, to shut down Trent's blatant disrespect. I expected him to defend the mother of his child against a man who constantly threw his unearned privilege in our faces. Instead, Julian slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, causing the wine glasses to rattle dangerously. "Trent is absolutely right, Nadia." Julian snapped, his face twisted in annoyance. "Put the phone away right now. You have been completely distracted all evening. You are acting classless in front of my family, and it reflects poorly on me. I am tired of making excuses for your lack of etiquette. Either you apologize to Trent right now for ruining the dinner, or you pack your things and leave my mother's house." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Apologize to Trent. Apologize to the man who had just insulted my upbringing, my character, and my mere presence at the table. I looked at Julian, trying to find any trace of the man I thought I had married. There was nothing but cold, arrogant pride. He was desperate for the approval of a man who secretly despised him. Before I could even form a response, Brenda chimed in. She was slicing the roast with surgical precision, not even bothering to look in my direction. We elevated you, Nadia, Brenda said, her voice smooth and venomous. We allowed you to sit at this table. We gave you access to a life you could only dream of when you were growing up in that dreadful little neighborhood. Do not bring your gutter habits into this family. We expect a certain standard of behavior in this house, and you are failing miserably. Vanessa let out a sharp, cruel snicker from across the table. She adjusted her diamond necklace and smiled at her husband. She just does not know any better. Mom. Vanessa chimed in, her tone laced with fake pity. You cannot buy class. Trent is just trying to teach her proper etiquette. It is not his fault she is too stubborn to learn how to behave around successful people. She probably thinks her little accounting job makes her important. They sat there in their tailored suits and designer dresses, tearing me down piece by piece. They expected me to cry. They expected me to lower my head, beg for forgiveness, and desperately try to win back their approval. That is the dynamic they had established from the very moment I entered this family. I was supposed to be the grateful outsider, forever indebted to their wealth and status. But I did not cry. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. The offshore accounts were verified. The trap was set. I had endured 5 years of their microaggressions, their condescension, and their profound financial manipulation. I had smiled through their insults to maintain the peace for the sake of my daughter. But I no longer needed to pretend. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth, and placed the cloth neatly beside my plate. I stood up, pushing my chair back. The scrape of the wood against the floor echoed loudly in the dining room. I reached down and gently took Arya by the hand. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, holding her favorite stuffed bear tight against her chest. Come on, sweetie, I said, keeping my voice soft and reassuring for her sake. We are going to go put your coat on. We are leaving. Brenda stopped slicing the meat. Julian stood up, his face flushing with extreme anger. He clearly had not expected me to actually call his bluff. Where do you think you are going? He demanded, his voice rising to a shout. Sit back down and apologize, Nadia. Do not make a scene in front of everyone. I turned to face him, fully holding my daughter's hand tightly. I looked at the man who had just traded his wife's dignity for his brother-in-law's approval. Are you absolutely sure about this, Julian? I asked. My voice was completely level, stripped of any emotion. I want you to think very carefully about your next words. Are you telling me to leave? Julian crossed his arms, puffing out his chest to assert his dominance in front of his mother and Trent. I am telling you that if you cannot respect this family and apologize to Trent, you need to get out of my sight. Leave, Nadia. You are ruining the holiday. I nodded slowly, recording his words in my memory. Have a Merry Christmas, Julian, I said. I did not wait for his response. I guided Arya out of the dining room and into the grand foyer. I helped her into her warm winter coat and boots, then slipped on my own jacket. The house was silent behind me. They were probably already laughing, patting Julian on the back for putting me in my place. They thought I would drive back to our house, cry myself to sleep, and beg for his forgiveness in the morning. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The cold air hit my face, feeling incredibly refreshing after the stifling toxicity of that house. Snow was falling gently, coating the city streets in a pristine layer of white. I walked Arya to my car, securely buckled her into her car seat, and closed the door. Before getting into the driver's seat, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my encrypted email application and found the message I had drafted earlier that afternoon. The subject line read, Initiate Protocol Phoenix. I tapped send, watching the progress bar confirm the delivery to the Federal Investigation Unit. I got into the car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the historic brownstone behind. What Julian, Trent, Vanessa, and Brenda did not know was that I had left something highly specific behind for them. Tucked perfectly under Brenda's massive, beautifully decorated Christmas tree, wrapped in shimmering gold paper and tied with a dark velvet ribbon, was a small, heavy box. It was the only gift I had brought for the family. And right at that very moment, hidden beneath the wrapping paper, a small device inside that box began to emit a faint, rhythmic ticking sound. The countdown had officially started, and they had absolutely no idea that their perfect, wealthy lives were about to be completely demolished. The drive to O'Hare International Airport took exactly 42 minutes. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the Chicago streets in a thick layer of white. I kept the heater on high for Aria, who had fallen asleep the moment her head hit the side of her car seat. Her small chest rose and fell in a peaceful rhythm, completely unaware of the absolute destruction I had just set into motion. I drove with both hands firmly on the wheel, feeling a strange sense of clarity. For 7 years I had walked on eggshells around Julian and his family. I had muted my own intelligence, dulled my own shine, and swallowed their constant insults just to keep the peace. But the peace was a lie. And tonight the lie was finally over. I pulled into the VIP parking structure at the international terminal. The bright fluorescent lights overhead felt like a stark contrast to the dark, opulent dining room I had just left behind. I carefully unbuckled Aria, holding her close to my chest, as I grabbed my 2 suitcases. I walked through the automatic sliding doors into the bustling terminal. Even on Christmas night, the airport was alive with travelers. I bypassed the massive lines of economy passengers and headed straight for the private first-class check-in counter for the Swiss Airlines flight to Zurich. My phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I knew who it was without even looking. I guided Aria to a plush leather chair near the counter, handed her a small coloring book from my bag, and pulled the phone out. Julian was calling. I swiped to answer and brought the device to my ear. Nadia, you have exactly 10 seconds to tell me you are parked at the end of the street cooling off. Julian's voice was low, dripping with that familiar condescending tone he used when he felt he needed to manage my emotions. His background noise was quiet, meaning he had stepped away from the dining room to handle his unruly wife away from the eyes of his precious mother and brother-in-law. I am not parked at the end of the street, Julian, I replied, my voice completely steady. I am at the airport. I am checking in for a flight. He let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. An actual laugh. You are throwing a tantrum, Nadia. A childish, ridiculous tantrum because Trent hurt your feelings. This is exactly why my mother says you lack emotional regulation. Now turn the car around, bring my daughter back to this house, and apologize before I get genuinely angry. I am not coming back, Julian. We are leaving just like you ordered. The line went dead silent for a moment before his tone shifted from patronizing to threatening. You are not going anywhere, Nadia. Do you hear me? You do not have the resources to pull a stunt like this. I am logging into the banking app right now. I am canceling your credit cards. I am freezing the checking account. I am cutting off your access to every single dime of my money. You will not even be able to buy a bottle of water at that airport, let alone a flight. You are going to be stranded there with a hungry child, and you will have to call me begging for a ride home. You can freeze whatever accounts you want, Julian, I said calmly. It makes no difference to me. You are bluffing. He spat, his voice echoing with absolute arrogance. You are a mid-level accountant who married into a legacy family. You have nothing without me. You are nothing without my last name. Turn the car around, Nadia. I ended the call without another word. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped up to the polished marble counter. The ticketing agent smiled warmly, asking for my passport. I handed it over and began confirming our flight details. I felt a sense of relief washing over me. The hard part was over. I was finally free. But Julian was never one to simply let go of control. Excuse me, ma'am. The voice came from directly behind me, deep and authoritative. I turned around slowly. 2 airport police officers were standing there, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. Their expressions were serious, evaluating me with intense scrutiny. The taller officer stepped forward, slightly blocking my path back to the terminal. Are you Nadia Wilson? He asked. Yes, I am, officer, I replied, keeping my posture relaxed and my hands visible. Is there a problem? The officer glanced at Arya, who was sitting quietly in the leather chair, her eyes wide as she looked at the men in uniform. We received an urgent call from a Julian Wilson. He stated that his wife has taken their 5-year-old daughter after a domestic dispute and is attempting to flee the country without his consent. He wants to file parental kidnapping charges. We are going to need you to step away from the counter and provide your identification, ma'am. I felt a flash of cold anger. Not fear, but pure, unadulterated anger. Julian had actually called the police. He was trying to use the law to intimidate me, to physically stop me from leaving his sphere of control. He thought a display of authority would make me cower and run back to him crying. Right on cue, my phone began to ring again. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. Julian. Is that him? The second officer asked, gesturing to my phone. Yes, it is, I said. I answered the call and immediately put it on speakerphone, holding it out so the officers could hear every single word. Nadia Julian's voice blasted through the speaker, loud and triumphant. I told you I was not playing games. I warned you to come back. The police should be finding you right about now. I told them you took my daughter without my permission. You are trying to kidnap an heir to the Wilson family. You really thought you could just walk away from me. The taller officer leaned in close to the phone. Mr. Wilson, this is Officer Davis with the airport police. We have located your wife and daughter. We are assessing the situation right now, officer. Thank God, Julian said, his voice instantly transforming into the smooth, polished tone of a deeply concerned executive father. My wife is not thinking clearly. She had a mental breakdown at dinner and just grabbed my daughter and ran. I have frozen all her financial assets to stop her from doing something crazy. She does not have a dime to her name. She cannot even buy a ticket. Please hold her there. I am sending my driver to come collect them. She is completely dependent on me, and she is not in her right mind. The officers looked at me, their expressions softening slightly into a mix of pity and caution. They were hearing the story of a desperate broke housewife trying to run away with a child she had no legal right to take across international borders. Ma'am, the officer said gently, I need you to hand over your identification and any travel documents you have. If you do not have the father's legal consent to take the child out of the country, we cannot allow you to board that plane. And if he is pursuing kidnapping charges, we will have to detain you until this is sorted out in family court. Julian laughed through the speakerphone, a cruel, victorious sound. Did you hear that, Nadia? The game is over. You embarrassed me in front of Trent and my mother. You thought you were so smart, but you are just a failure from the South Side. Now hand the phone to the officer and wait for the car. I took a slow, deep breath. The scent of the airport, the bright lights, the hum of the luggage belts, everything felt sharply in focus. I looked at the two officers who were waiting for me to surrender. Then I looked down at my sleek leather briefcase, resting on top of my luggage. Officer Davis. I said, my voice projecting an unwavering, absolute authority. I am going to open my briefcase now to provide my documentation. The officer nodded, keeping a watchful eye on me. I unzipped the leather bag and reached inside. I did not pull out a desperate plea or a tearful excuse. I pulled out a thick, legally bound document bearing an official state seal and several electronic signatures. I handed the document directly to the officer. What you are looking at is a legally binding custodial addendum. I explained clearly, making sure my voice carried directly into the microphone for Julian to hear. It grants me sole legal and physical custody of Aria Wilson, including full international travel rights, without the need for secondary parental consent. The officer frowned, reading over the document. His eyes scanned the paragraphs, landing on the notarized signatures at the bottom. This has your husband's signature on it, the officer noted, sounding surprised. Julian went completely silent on the speakerphone. That is impossible, Julian suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. I never signed a custody agreement. She is lying. It is a fake document. Arrest her. I smiled a cold, sharp smile. It is not a fake, Julian. Do you remember last month when your mother demanded you update your life insurance policies to protect the business? Do you remember when you complained that the paperwork was too boring and long for you to read? You asked me to summarize it for you. You blindly clicked the electronic signature box on 20 different pages while you were drinking scotch and watching the football game. You never read a single word of what you signed. You signed away your custodial rights exactly 4 weeks ago. This document has been filed, registered, and processed by a federal judge. The officer looked from the paper to me, then down at the phone. The document appears completely legitimate, Mr. Wilson. the officer said, his tone shifting. It is notarized and filed with the county clerk. She has full legal authority to travel with the child. No, Julian screamed, losing his polished facade entirely. She cannot go anywhere. I froze her accounts. I canceled her cards. She cannot buy a ticket. She is broke. You hear me? She is a broke nobody. I reached back into my briefcase. I bypassed my normal wallet and pulled out a small black velvet card holder. I opened it and extracted a heavy, solid metal black card. It caught the light of the terminal gleaming with quiet, supreme power. It was not a card tied to Julian's bank. It was an elite-tier corporate card issued directly by my own independent wealth management firm, a firm Julian knew absolutely nothing about. I stepped over to a nearby trash can holding the joint credit card Julian had given me years ago, the one he constantly used to control my spending and track my movements. I dropped his plastic card into the garbage. You can keep your money, Julian, I said into the phone. I have never needed it. I handed the heavy metal black card to the ticketing agent who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence. Please finalize the 2 first-class tickets to Zurich, I told the agent. The police officers stepped back, realizing they had stepped into the middle of a scenario where they had absolutely no jurisdiction. Julian had lied to them. He had weaponized emergency resources to control his wife, and it had backfired spectacularly. Ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience, Officer Davis said, handing the custody documents back to me. You are free to proceed. Have a safe flight. Thank you, officers, I replied smoothly. On the phone, Julian was hyperventilating. Nadia, what did you do? What black card is that? Where are you getting the money for first-class international tickets? Answer me. I looked down at the phone one last time. I will let you figure that out, Julian. You and Trent should probably check your email, the one with the subject line, Protocol Phoenix. I ended the call and powered my phone off, completely severing his connection to me. The ticketing agent handed me our boarding passes with a highly respectful nod, gesturing toward the private security lane. I took Arya by the hand, picking up my briefcase and my luggage. We walked through the quiet, empty priority lane, leaving the chaos of my old life behind us. The airport staff escorted us directly into the VIP lounge, where a private attendant offered Arya a warm hot chocolate and brought me a glass of crisp champagne. We boarded the massive aircraft a short time later, settling into our spacious enclosed suites. The heavy cabin doors were shut, sealing us away from the freezing Chicago winter. Arya curled up under a plush blanket, her eyes heavy with sleep. I sat in my luxurious seat, the faint hum of the jet engines vibrating through the floorboards. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the undeniable flavor of absolute victory. Thousands of miles below us, back at the historic brownstone, the scene was unfolding exactly as I had calculated. The perfectly roasted prime rib was sitting cold on the dining table. Trent, furious and completely unnerved by Julian's frantic behavior, decided he needed to escape the tension. He walked into the hallway, pulling out his phone to book a private emergency flight to Las Vegas for the weekend, intending to use the family logistics company corporate card to fund his sudden getaway. Trent navigated to the private charter website, entering the corporate card details with practiced ease. He hit confirm and waited for the booking to process. The screen loaded slowly. Then a harsh red error message flashed across the display. Transaction declined. Trent frowned, his white privilege flaring into instant annoyance. He tapped the screen, entering the numbers again, assuming it was a simple bank error. Transaction declined. Before he could call the bank to scream at a customer service representative, his personal cell phone chimed. It was an automated text message from the massive banking institution that held the family business accounts. Trent opened the message, his eyes scanning the text. His face drained of all color, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device on the hardwood floor. The message read, "Corporate accounts frozen. Access denied pending federal IRS audit and active Treasury investigation. Please contact your legal representative immediately." The ticking sound from the beautifully wrapped gift under the Christmas tree suddenly seemed extremely loud in the quiet house. The countdown had reached 0. The explosion had begun. The steady hum of this aircraft engines provided a soothing background noise as we finally reached cruising altitude. Inside the private first-class suite, the world felt a million miles away. I adjusted the soft cashmere blanket over Arya, who was already fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. She looked so peaceful, completely untouched by the chaos I had just unleashed on the people she called her family. I brushed a loose curl from her forehead, feeling a profound sense of relief. For 5 years, I had carefully shielded her from the toxic environment of the Wilson household, making sure she never absorbed the subtle cruelty and blatant disrespect they threw my way. Now she would never have to sit at that mahogany dining table again. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and pulled my laptop from my leather briefcase. I placed it on the polished tray table and opened the screen. The glowing light illuminated my face in the dim cabin. I logged into my secure network, navigating through multiple layers of biometric authentication and encrypted servers. I was not a low-level clerk. I was a senior forensic accountant and a specialist in corporate risk management. For over a decade, I had been hired by federal agencies and international banking institutions to track down missing funds, dismantle money laundering operations, and expose corporate fraud. I had a gift for seeing the stories hidden inside numbers. And for the last 5 years, the most fascinating story I had been reading was the systematic financial destruction of the Wilson family logistics firm. It started shortly after Julian and I were married. I had offered to help him with his personal taxes, and I noticed a strange discrepancy in his income statements. Small anomalies that most people would overlook, but to a trained eye, they were glaring red flags. I dug a little deeper, quietly accessing the public records of the family business. What I found was a staggering level of financial incompetence. But it was not just incompetence. When Trent married into the family and Brenda blindly handed him the position of chief financial officer, the incompetence evolved into outright criminal fraud. While they mocked my quiet demeanor and my simple tailored suits, I was spending my evenings mirroring their corporate servers. I watched every single transaction they made. I tracked how Trent and Julian were systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the family logistics company. They were bleeding the employee pension funds dry, creating fake vendor invoices for phantom trucking routes, and funneling the cash directly into offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. I sat at family dinners listening to Vanessa brag about her brand new Porsche and her spontaneous shopping trips to Paris, knowing exactly which stolen pension fund had paid for her designer luggage. I listened to Trent give pompous speeches about legacy wealth and the superiority of old money while I tracked his massive gambling debts. He was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to private casinos in Macau to cover his losses, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of his immense wealth. And Julian, my own husband, was completely complicit. He signed off on the fraudulent ledgers, approving the fake invoices because he was too greedy to stop the cash flow and too desperate for Trent's validation to ask questions. They thought they were untouchable geniuses who were outsmarting the system. In reality, they were leaving a digital paper trail so wide and so obvious it was almost insulting to my profession. I clicked through the final audit reports on my screen. The numbers were staggering. They had embezzled over $14 million in a span of 4 years. The logistics company was effectively bankrupt, surviving only on a massive high-interest loan from a private Swiss holding company. They were one missed payment away from total default, but they were too busy admiring their luxury watches to realize their entire empire was built on a crumbling foundation of debt and deceit. My laptop chimed with an incoming notification. The plane's satellite Wi-Fi network had established a connection. Almost instantly, my phone began to vibrate violently on the tray table. The screen lit up with Julian's name. I let it ring for a few moments, simply watching the screen and taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. He was calling through a web-based application, meaning his standard cellular service was likely already experiencing the fallout of the frozen accounts. I swiped the screen and answered, putting the call on speaker so I could continue typing on my laptop. "What did you do to our accounts, you malicious witch?" Julian screamed. His voice was shrill, echoing with a level of pure, unadulterated panic I had never heard from him before. The polished, arrogant executive who had banished me from his mother's house just 2 hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man watching his entire life burn to the ground. I kept my voice perfectly level, matching the calm environment of the airplane cabin. I assume you finally opened your Christmas present, Julian. In the background of the call, I could hear absolute pandemonium. Brenda was wailing loudly, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the historic brownstone. Vanessa was shouting hysterically, demanding to know why her credit cards were suddenly declining, and Trent was shouting profanities, throwing things, and demanding someone call his lawyer. The beautifully wrapped gift I had left under their towering Christmas tree was not a box of expensive chocolates or a designer tie. It was a heavy-duty timed lockbox. I had programmed the digital timer to unlock exactly 2 hours after dinner began. When the countdown reached 0, the lid popped open, revealing a stack of federal documents. Inside were official copies of federal subpoenas, asset freeze notifications from the Department of the Treasury, and a detailed summary of my forensic audit. The ticking sound they had ignored was the sound of their impending doom. Nadia, what is this? Julian stammered, his breath catching in his throat. What are these papers? The bank just sent me an alert that our corporate accounts are locked. Trent's cards are declining. The mortgage accounts are frozen. The personal accounts are gone. What did you do? Tell me what you did right now. I leaned back in my luxurious leather seat, watching the flight progress map on the screen in front of me. We were currently flying over the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the wreckage of his life far behind. I didn't do anything, Julian. I said, my tone conversational and completely unbothered. I simply did my job. I just forwarded my forensic audit of your fraudulent ledgers to the Swiss holding company that technically owns your debt. You see, Julian, when you borrow $50 million from a ruthless European investment firm, they tend to get very upset when they discover you have been falsifying your revenue reports to hide massive embezzlement. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The background noise in the brownstone suddenly went dead silent. He must have put the phone on speaker for the rest of the family to hear. I could picture them all standing in that opulent living room, staring at the phone in absolute horror as the pieces finally clicked together in their arrogant minds. The woman they had relentlessly mocked as a low-level clerk was actually the architect of their total destruction. You sent them our financial records. Trent's voice came through the speaker, shaking with rage and fear. You cannot do that. That is illegal. You stole proprietary company information. We will sue you. We will have you thrown in jail. I laughed, a soft, genuine sound that felt incredibly liberating. You cannot sue anyone, Trent. You do not have the money to pay a retainer. The Swiss holding company immediately triggered the default clause in your loan agreement the moment they verified my audit. They froze your corporate accounts to prevent you from fleeing the country with their remaining capital. And since you and Julian used the company funds to cross-collateralize your personal assets, the bank froze those too. Everything is gone. The cars, the houses, the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I gave the routing numbers directly to the federal investigators. Nadia, please. Julian begged, his voice cracking as the reality of his situation crushed his ego. You have to stop this. You can call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you made an error in the audit. We are your family. We can fix this. I will give you anything you want. Just please fix it. It is entirely out of my hands, Julian, I replied smoothly, typing a few more commands into my laptop. The federal authorities have the files now, but that is not even the best part. I am not just the whistleblower. I am a highly respected consultant for that exact Swiss holding company. When I presented them with the proof of your fraud, I also presented them with a solution. I offered to acquire your defaulted debt at a significant discount. They accepted my proposal an hour ago. I'm flying to Zurich to sign the paperwork for a hostile takeover. I let the words hang in the air, allowing the sheer magnitude of my statement to settle over them. I was not just destroying their company, I was buying it. I was taking ownership of everything they had built, everything they had stolen, and everything they claimed gave them superiority over me. The legacy wealth they constantly threw in my face was about to become my personal property. No, Vanessa shrieked in the background, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. You cannot take our money. You are just a pathetic little nobody. Julian, do something. Tell her to stop. Julian was breathing heavily into the phone, unable to form a coherent sentence. He had spent years telling me I was nothing without his last name. He had threatened to leave me penniless at the airport. Now he was standing in a house he no longer owned, staring at a future behind federal prison bars, while his wife flew first class to purchase his entire life. Suddenly, there was a shuffling sound, and a new voice came on the line. It was Brenda, the proud, haughty matriarch who had spent the evening telling me I possessed gutter habits and did not belong at her elegant dining table. Nadia, listen to me, Brenda said, her voice trembling violently. She was trying desperately to sound authoritative, but the fear completely undermined her efforts. She shifted instantly from arrogant demands to frantic pleading, trying to weaponize the very things she had previously used to exclude me. Nadia, you can't do this to us. We are family. We are Black people. We have to stick together. You know how hard it is for us to build wealth in this country. You cannot tear down everything my husband worked so hard to build. We took you in. We embraced you. You cannot destroy your own people over a misunderstanding. It was Trent's idea. Trent made Julian do it. You know Julian has a good heart. Please, Nadia, I am begging you as a mother. The absolute hypocrisy of her words was astounding. For 7 years, she had gone out of her way to remind me that I was not truly one of them. She had allowed a privileged white man to disrespect me in her home simply because he came from money. She had happily spent the millions they embezzled, never once caring about the working-class employees whose pensions were being destroyed to fund her lavish lifestyle. And now, when the consequences of her greed were finally knocking at her door, she suddenly wanted to invoke racial solidarity and family loyalty. She was willing to throw Trent under the bus in a heartbeat to save her own skin. I looked at Arya sleeping peacefully beside me. I thought about the kind of woman I wanted her to become. I wanted her to be strong, independent, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting her own peace. I wanted her to know that she never had to accept disrespect from anyone, regardless of their status or their bank account. I had broken the cycle. I brought the phone closer to my mouth, ensuring my voice was crystal clear. You told me I didn't belong in your family, Brenda. I said, my words slicing through her desperate pleas with cold, absolute finality. You got your wish. I pressed the red button to end the call, terminating the connection immediately. I did not block their numbers. I wanted to see the notifications of their panic. I wanted a digital record of their desperation as their world collapsed around them. I placed the phone back on the table and returned to my laptop, feeling lighter than I had in years. The flight to Zurich would take another 8 hours, giving me plenty of time to review the acquisition contracts. I took another sip of my sparkling water and smiled as the plane carried me toward my new empire. The heavy oak door of the historic brownstone rattled under the force of a loud, authoritative knock. Inside the dining room, the silence was absolute. The cold, roasted prime rib sat untouched on the table, and the open-timed lockbox rested underneath the shimmering Christmas tree, its contents spilling onto the expensive Persian rug. Julian stared at the front door, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket, forcing a confident expression onto his face. He looked back at Brenda and Trent, offering a tight, arrogant smile. That must be the airport police, Julian said, his voice dripping with false bravado. I told you she would not get far. They probably brought her back in handcuffs. I will handle this, and then we are going to have a very serious discussion about where she and that child are going to sleep tonight, because it will not be under my roof. Julian marched into the grand foyer and pulled the heavy door open, ready to dispense his patronizing authority onto whatever local officers had detained his wife. But the men standing on the snow-covered porch were not local airport police, and they did not have Nadia with them. 6 men stood in the freezing cold, wearing dark winter coats over sharp suits. The man at the front held up a leather wallet displaying a federal badge. He did not smile. He did not offer holiday greetings. He simply looked at Julian with the cold, detached efficiency of a man executing a profound legal mandate. "Julian Wilson?" the agent asked. "Yes," Julian replied, his voice faltering slightly as he took a step back. "Who are you? What is this about? Is this about my wife?" "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Department of the Treasury," the agent stated, stepping across the threshold without waiting for an invitation. The other 5 agents followed him inside, crowding the opulent foyer and bringing the freezing winter air into the warm house. "We are here to serve preliminary asset seizure notices and federal preservation orders regarding the Wilson Family Logistics Corporation and all associated personal accounts cross-collateralized with corporate funds." Brenda walked into the foyer clutching her pearl necklace, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage. "Excuse me," Brenda demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You cannot just barge into my home on Christmas night. My late husband built this company from the ground up. We are highly respected members of this community. You have the wrong house and you need to leave immediately before I call the mayor." The lead agent did not even blink at her display of matriarchal authority. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and handed them directly to Julian. "Ma'am, this property is listed as a primary collateral asset on a defaulted $50 million corporate loan held by a Swiss investment firm. Furthermore, we have received verified forensic evidence indicating massive ongoing wire fraud and embezzlement originating from the corporate accounts of your logistics firm. As of 20 minutes ago, a federal judge approved the freezing of all corporate and personal financial assets tied to Julian Wilson and Trent Blackwell. You are officially prohibited from moving, selling, or destroying any property within this residence." Trent pushed past Vanessa and stormed into the foyer, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He snatched the documents out of Julian's shaking hands and began tearing through the pages. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching for a loophole, searching for a way out. He reached the second page and stopped completely still. The document listed the exact routing numbers of his hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The accounts he thought were invisible. The accounts he had funneled $14 million of stolen pension funds into. Trent dropped the papers onto the floor as if they had burned his fingers. The mask of the civilized, wealthy executive melted away instantly, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. The reality of his situation shattered his arrogant facade. He was not an untouchable financial genius. He was a criminal who had just been caught, and his white privilege offered absolutely zero protection against the federal agents standing in his living room. Trent turned slowly to face Julian. The polite condescension he usually reserved for his brother-in-law morphed into vicious, overt hatred. "You stupid, incompetent fool," Trent screamed, the veins bulging in his neck. "I told you your street rat wife was a liability. I told you to keep her in check. You brought that vindictive woman into this family and now she has ruined us." Julian flinched, raising his hands defensively. "Do not blame me for this, Trent. You were the chief financial officer. You told me the shell accounts were untraceable. You said the Swiss firm would never look closely at the operational ledgers. You made me sign those transfer authorizations." "I made you sign them." Trent laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the house. "You signed them because you are a weak, pathetic coward who wanted the lifestyle without having the intelligence to earn it yourself. You pretend to be high society, Julian, but you are nothing. This whole family is nothing but a bunch of ghetto upstarts playing dress-up. I should have never married into this classless circus. You drag everyone down with your incompetence." The racist, classist venom pouring out of Trent's mouth struck the family like a physical blow. Brenda gasped, stepping back as if she had been slapped. For 5 years she had enabled Trent's microaggressions because he came from money. She had elevated him above her own daughter-in-law because he fit her twisted image of respectability politics. Now the man she had welcomed with open arms was calling her family classless upstarts in her own foyer while federal agents watched in silence. While Trent and Julian screamed at each other, exchanging vicious insults and shifting the blame, Vanessa quietly dropped to her knees on the floor. The golden child of the Wilson family, the woman who wore Cartier bracelets and laughed at my working-class background, was trembling as she gathered the scattered legal documents. She ignored the shouting men and focused on the attached schedule of assets slated for federal seizure. She read through the list of frozen bank accounts, identifying the joint checking accounts, the corporate expense accounts, and the family trust funds. Then her manicured finger stopped on a specific line item. It was an account registered at a private bank in the Bahamas. She looked at the registered owner of the account. It did not say Trent and Vanessa Blackwell. It said Trent Blackwell as the sole signatory. She looked at the frozen balance listed beside the name. $8.5 million. Vanessa slowly stood up. Her designer dress wrinkled, her perfect hair slightly disheveled. She looked at Trent, who was still berating Julian about his lack of business acumen. Vanessa realized with crushing clarity why Trent had been rushing to the hallway with his phone right after my phone call. He was not trying to fix the situation. He was trying to book a private flight. He was going to take the $8 million he had hidden in a solo account and flee the country. He was going to leave his wife to face the federal prosecutors alone. He was going to let her take the fall for the money he had stolen to fund his gambling habits. Vanessa walked up to Trent. He turned to her, his face still twisted in anger, expecting her to defend him as she always did. Instead, Vanessa raised her hand and slapped him across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp crack of her palm against his cheek silenced the entire room. Even the federal agents raised their eyebrows in surprise. "You were leaving me!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice raw and breaking. "You put $8 million in a solo account in the Bahamas and you were going to the airport. I defended you to my family. I let you insult my sister-in-law. I wore the clothes you bought with stolen money, and you were going to abandon me to go to federal prison." Trent rubbed his red cheek and looked at his wife with absolute disdain. "Grow up, Vanessa," he sneered, adjusting his suit jacket. "Did you really think I was going to sink with this pathetic ship? You were a convenient cover story and accessory I used to get access to your father's company. You think you are sophisticated, but you are just a spoiled child who spent money she did not understand. You are broke, Vanessa. You have nothing." Vanessa let out a guttural scream of pure despair and collapsed onto the staircase, burying her face in her hands. Her entire identity, her wealth, her status, her marriage had been erased in a matter of minutes. She was no longer the wealthy socialite looking down on the world. She was the penniless wife of a con artist waiting to be indicted. Thousands of miles away, the morning sun was rising over the snow-capped mountains surrounding Zurich. The air was crisp, clean, and tasted of absolute freedom. I stepped out of a sleek, black chauffeured vehicle, wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a long wool coat. I walked with Arya's hand securely in mine toward the towering glass and steel headquarters of the Swiss holding company that owned the Wilson family's debt. I was escorted by a silent professional assistant into a massive high-tech boardroom on the top floor. The room featured a panoramic view of the city, but my focus was entirely on the long glass table. 5 senior executives sat waiting for me. They were older, distinguished European bankers who dealt in billions of dollars and international corporate acquisitions. They looked at me with polite skepticism. To them, I was an unknown American woman, claiming to possess the key to a $50 million defaulted loan that their risk management department had been desperately trying to salvage. I did not offer small talk. I did not ask for their approval. I guided Arya to a comfortable leather chair in the corner of the room, handing her a new tablet loaded with her favorite cartoons. Then I walked to the head of the table, opened my briefcase, and connected my laptop to the main projection screen. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting total, unwavering confidence. "For the past 4 years, your firm has been funding the operational deficits of the Wilson Family Logistics Corporation. You were provided with falsified revenue projections and manipulated asset ledgers. The company you loaned $50 million to is completely insolvent." The lead executive, a stern man with silver hair, frowned. "Miss Wilson, we are aware of the default status. However, the collateral assets secured against the loan are substantial. We intend to liquidate the property and the physical logistics fleet to recover our capital." "You cannot liquidate what is currently being seized by the United States federal government," I replied, tapping my keyboard. I pulled up the official seizure notices I had forwarded to the FBI onto the large screen. The executives leaned forward, their skepticism vanishing instantly as they read the federal document numbers. The collateral you are relying on has been cross-contaminated with embezzled funds, I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. The chief financial officer, Trent Blackwell, and the operations executive, Julian Wilson, have systematically drained $14 million from the employee pension fund. They used your operational loan to cover the pension shortages, while simultaneously funneling the stolen cash into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Because your loan funds were mixed with stolen federal pension money, the United States Treasury has frozen all physical and liquid assets tied to the corporation. Your $50 million loan is effectively trapped behind years of federal litigation. You will recover nothing. The boardroom was dead silent. The executives stared at the screen, the reality of their massive financial exposure sinking in. The lead executive took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. You seem remarkably well informed about a fraud that our own internal auditors failed to detect, Miss Wilson. Why are you presenting this to us now? Because I am the one who conducted the forensic audit, I stated, pulling up the exact routing logs and offshore account numbers. I tracked every single wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, and every hidden account. I have the digital keys to the $14 million sitting in the Caribbean. The federal agents have the physical assets, but I have the map to the liquid cash. The executives exchanged rapid, calculated glances. They understood the leverage I held. They knew that without my audit trail, recovering any portion of their investment would be a bureaucratic nightmare that could take a decade to resolve. What is your proposal? The lead executive asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to highly respectful. I am not here to simply hand over my audit, I said, closing my laptop and resting my hands on the glass table. I am here to make an acquisition. I propose to buy the defaulted debt of the Wilson Family Logistics Corporation from your firm for 20 cents on the dollar. You write off the loss immediately, clearing your books of a toxic federal asset. In exchange, I provide you with the immediate recovery of the $14 million in offshore funds to offset your initial loss. Once I own the debt, I will negotiate directly with the federal prosecutors, using my audit as leverage to release the physical corporate assets to me. The bankers sat in stunned silence. They were watching a masterclass in hostile corporate takeover. I was using the very money Trent and Julian had stolen to buy the debt they had defaulted on, essentially acquiring their entire logistics empire for a fraction of its true value. I was cutting out the middleman and positioning myself as the sole owner of the company that had once employed me as a lowly clerk. We will need an hour to review the proposal with our legal department, the executive said, standing up and extending his hand. But I must admit, Miss Wilson, your preparation is extraordinary. Take your time, gentlemen, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. I have nowhere else to be. An hour and a half later, I signed a stack of dense legal documents finalizing the transfer of the debt. With a few precise strokes of a sleek metal pen, I became the sole owner of everything the Wilson family possessed. The logistics fleet, the corporate contracts, the commercial warehouses, all of it belonged to me. The legacy Brenda had bragged about, the wealth Vanessa had flaunted, the power Julian had used to try and break me. I owned it all. I walked out of the bank holding Arya's hand, stepping back into the crisp Zurich air. The sunlight felt warm on my face. I had done it. I had dismantled their empire and built my own on top of the ruins. As I walked toward my waiting car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Julian. The federal agents must have finally left the brownstone, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his life. He was terrified, stripped of his power, but he was still trying to use his favorite weapon: intimidation. The text was a long, desperate block of words. Our lawyers are ruthless, Nadia. You think you have won because you locked our accounts, but you have no idea who you are dealing with. We have a mediation hearing the day you get back. I will destroy you in court. I will tell the judge you are an unstable mother who kidnapped my child. I will strip your parental rights and leave you in the gutter where you belong. You better be ready to surrender when you walk into that room. I stood on the sidewalk reading the pathetic, threatening message from a man who did not even realize he was already a ghost. He still thought he had corporate lawyers on a massive retainer. He still thought he had the high ground. He still believed that his status as a Wilson would protect him from the reality of his own actions. I did not feel angry. I did not feel afraid. I just smiled. It was a genuine bright smile that reached my eyes. I opened my airline application on my phone and booked 2 first-class tickets back to Chicago for the following week. I typed a simple 2-word reply to his long, unhinged threat. See you. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I opened the door to the luxury car, helping Aria into the back seat before sliding in beside her. I told the driver to take us to the best chocolate shop in the city. The hostile takeover was complete, and now it was time to go home and watch the house of cards finally hit the floor. 2 weeks had passed since the cold Zurich air cleared my lungs. 2 weeks of meticulous, highly classified work alongside international banking regulators and federal agents. I had left Aria safely playing at home with her trusted nanny, surrounded by new toys and completely shielded from the ugly reality of her father's impending incarceration. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the prestigious downtown Chicago law firm, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of purpose. The towering skyscraper offered a commanding view of the city, but the people waiting for me on the 42nd floor were about to find out how quickly a long drop to the bottom could happen. The receptionist led me through a maze of frosted glass corridors. I was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that commanded respect. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors, echoing the ticking sound of that lockbox I had left under their Christmas tree. The heavy double doors of the main conference room swung open, and I stepped inside. They were all there, sitting along one side of an enormous mahogany table. Julian, Trent, Brenda, and Vanessa. They looked like a poorly arranged family portrait. They were trying desperately to project their usual aura of untouchable wealth, but the cracks in their foundation were glaringly obvious. Trent was sweating profusely, his face a mottled red, his expensive suit looking slightly wrinkled as if he had slept in it. Vanessa sat beside him, clutching a designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white, her face pale and devoid of her usual arrogant smirk. Brenda sat perfectly rigid, wearing her signature pearls like a suit of armor, her eyes narrowing the second I walked into the room. And Julian sat in the center, trying to look dominant, trying to puff out his chest, but the dark circles under his eyes told the true story of his last 14 days. Flanking them at the head of the table was their defense attorney. He was an older man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit, projecting an air of supreme condescension. He looked at me as if I were a minor annoyance, a temporary stain on his very expensive schedule. He did not know who I really was. Julian and his family were so blinded by their own arrogance that they had clearly lied to their own legal counsel. They still truly believed I was just a scorned, hysterical wife who had gotten lucky with a banking glitch. They actually thought they still had the upper hand. I sat down on the opposite side of the long table, placing my slim leather briefcase in front of me. I did not say a word. I simply folded my hands and waited for them to begin their performance. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Miss Wilson," he began, his voice smooth and dripping with patronizing authority. "My name is Arthur Sterling, representing your husband and the Wilson family estate. We are here today to resolve this unfortunate domestic dispute quickly and quietly." I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not correct him when he called it a domestic dispute. I let him continue digging their grave. "My clients are willing to be reasonable despite your highly erratic and illegal behavior." Mr. Sterling continued, folding his hands on the table. "You have caused a significant disruption to their business operations by making false reports to their banking institutions. However, we understand that divorce can make people act out of character. We have prepared a comprehensive settlement agreement." He slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. The document stopped right in front of my briefcase. I did not even look at it. "Sign this NDA, hand over whatever files you stole, and my clients will generously give you a $50,000 payout and joint custody," Mr. Sterling stated, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "It is a highly favorable offer, Miss Wilson, considering you possess no personal assets and have committed multiple acts of corporate espionage." If you refuse, we will immediately file criminal charges against you for theft of proprietary data and pursue full sole custody of your daughter based on your mental instability." The sheer audacity of the offer was almost comical. $50,000 and an NDA in exchange for burying $14 million of federal wire fraud. They really thought I was an idiot. They really thought they could buy their way out of a federal indictment with pocket change. Julian leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, attempting to assert the dominance he had lost on Christmas night. His face was twisted into a smug, condescending sneer. He genuinely believed his expensive lawyer had just terrified me into submission. "Take the deal, Nadia." Julian set his voice low and threatening, trying to gaslight me one last time. "You are out of your depth. You cannot beat corporate lawyers. You threw your little tantrum, you caused some headaches, but the game is over now. Sign the paper. Take the money. Go back to whatever cheap apartment you are hiding in and be grateful I am not putting you in prison for kidnapping my child." Brenda chimed in from the end of the table, her voice cold and venomous. "We warned Julian about marrying someone from your background, Nadia. We knew you would eventually show your true colors. You tried to ruin this family out of pure jealousy because you could never truly belong in our world. Take the settlement and disappear. It is more money than someone like you deserves anyway." Vanessa let out a sharp, bitter laugh, adjusting her posture. "You actually thought you could outsmart us?" she sneered. "Trent has been working day and night with the legal team. You are a nobody, Nadia. You play with spreadsheets all day and you think you understand how real wealth works. We have connections you cannot even dream of." Trent sat silent, glaring at me with raw hatred. He knew the truth was much darker than a simple bank dispute, but his massive ego would not allow him to admit defeat to a black woman he had spent 5 years belittling. He was banking on the hope that his lawyer could intimidate me into handing over the only copies of the audit files before the authorities looked any closer at the accounts. I let their insults hang in the air. I absorbed their racism, their classism, their profound delusional arrogance. I slowly reached out and picked up a glass of sparkling water the legal assistant had poured for me. I took a slow, deliberate sip, allowing the silence in the room to stretch until it became suffocating. I set the glass down and finally looked directly into Julian's eyes. "I am not the plaintiff, Julian," I said, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Julian frowned, his smug smile faltering slightly. "What are you talking about? I did not touch their pathetic settlement offer." Instead, I opened my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a single pristine manila folder. I placed it on the table and pushed it forward, sliding it right over their useless NDA. The folder stopped directly in front of Arthur Sterling. Embossed on the front cover of the folder were two very distinct, very terrifying logos: the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. "I am not the plaintiff," I repeated, my voice carrying the absolute weight of federal authority. "I am the government-appointed forensic liquidator." The lawyer stared at the seals on the folder. His practiced calm vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what those seals meant. He reached out with a trembling hand and opened the folder. The first page was not a settlement offer. It was a federal mandate of corporate dissolution and total asset forfeiture. "Your company does not exist anymore," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on Julian, watching the color drain completely from his face. "I dissolved it yesterday." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The smug, arrogant expressions on the faces of the Wilson family melted away, leaving behind a portrait of absolute devastation. They were not sitting across from a scorned wife. They were sitting across from the executioner of their entire legacy. "What does she mean?" Julian stammered, looking frantically at his lawyer. "Arthur, tell her she cannot do that. Tell her the company is protected." Arthur Sterling did not answer his client. The lawyer was rapidly reading through the federal mandate, his eyes darting back and forth across the pages. He saw my signature on the bottom line, not as Nadia Wilson, the wife, but as Nadia Wilson, Senior Federal Forensic Auditor and Chief Restructuring Officer. He saw the list of offshore accounts, the exact amounts of embezzled pension funds, and the unsealed indictments waiting to be executed by the marshals. "You lied to me, Arthur," whispered his voice hoarse as he looked at Trent and Julian. "You told me this was a domestic dispute over a joint bank account. You told me she hacked a local server. You didn't tell me you stole $14 million from a federal pension fund. You didn't tell me she was a federal auditor." "We didn't know," Trent shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She is just an accountant. She does not have this kind of power. This is fake. It has to be fake." "It is not fake, Mr. Blackwell," Arthur said, closing the folder and pushing his chair away from the table as if the documents themselves were radioactive. "This is a federal liquidation order. You have no company. You have no assets. You have federal warrants pending for your arrest." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She looked at me, her eyes wide with horror, realizing that the woman she had treated like dirt was actually the one holding the shovel. Vanessa began to cry quietly, the reality of her impending poverty finally breaking through her delusions of grandeur. I calmly gathered my briefcase, standing up from the table. I smoothed the front of my suit jacket, looking down at the broken, pathetic remnants of the family that had tried to destroy me. I had one final piece of business to conduct before I left them to their fate. I turned my attention to the smug defense attorney who was currently trying to figure out how to distance himself from his radioactive clients. "And counselor?" I said, my voice slicing through the chaos of the room like a scalpel. "You might want to check the routing number of the retainer they paid you." Arthur Sterling froze, his eyes locking onto mine with sudden, desperate fear. "It matches an offshore account flagged for federal wire fraud." I continued, delivering the final killing blow with absolute precision. "If you continue to represent them, you are legally an accessory to money laundering." The lawyer's face went completely ashen. He looked at the folder, then at Julian, then back at me. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew that the very money paying his exorbitant hourly rate was stolen federal property. By accepting it, he had inadvertently tied himself to a massive criminal conspiracy that would cost him his license to practice law and likely his freedom. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel," Arthur said, his voice shaking as he stood up and backed away from the table. "Do not contact my office again." "Arthur, wait," Julian pleaded, reaching out toward the lawyer. "You cannot leave us. We paid you. With stolen federal funds." Arthur snapped, grabbing his briefcase. "I am leaving before the FBI raids this building. You are on your own." The lawyer practically sprinted out of the conference room, leaving the heavy double doors wide open. The great Wilson family was left sitting alone at the massive mahogany table, entirely defenseless, entirely broke, and entirely exposed to the reality of the federal prison sentences awaiting them. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the door, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing in the silent room. I did not look back. I did not need to. The house of cards had completely collapsed, and I was already walking out of the wreckage toward a bright, beautiful future with my daughter. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the hallway when Brenda shattered the quiet with a shrill, piercing scream. She simply could not accept defeat. She could not comprehend a reality where a woman from my background held absolute power over a family like hers. I stopped walking and turned slowly around to face them one last time. Brenda was standing at the far end of the massive mahogany table, her chest heaving violently, her signature pearl necklace shaking against her collarbone. "I am your mother-in-law," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperate, fragile authority. "I command you to drop this nonsense right now, Nadia. You will sign that settlement and you will fix whatever you have done to our accounts immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not show even a fraction of the anger she was radiating. I simply looked down at my watch, noting the exact time with clinical precision. "You do not command anything, Brenda." I said, my words dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "In fact, you might want to look out the window." The absolute chilling certainty in my tone made Julian turn his head instantly. He walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling glass, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the plush corporate carpet. Trent and Vanessa followed him, moving like sleepwalkers, their faces pressing against the thick pane of glass. Down on the street, 42 stories below the normal flow of downtown Chicago traffic had been completely obliterated. A massive fleet of matte black Federal Sport utility vehicles had swarmed the perimeter of the corporate building, blocking every single exit and loading dock. Even from the staggering height, the flashing red and blue lights painted the gray concrete and mirrored glass in a rhythmic strobe of impending doom. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed boldly across their backs were pouring out of the vehicles. They moved with terrifying military precision, establishing a hard physical perimeter and marching directly through the revolving glass doors of the main lobby. The reality of the situation crashed into the boardroom, suffocating them all. They were completely trapped in their own ivory tower. Trent backed away from the window, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. The polished, untouchable financial genius routine evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. He realized the trap had just snapped shut, and his mind could not process the finality of it. He spun around and locked his eyes on me. His fear instantly morphed into vicious, overt hatred. He charged across the room, closing the distance between us, and slammed both of his heavy fists onto the mahogany table. The expensive wood groaned under the violent impact. "You think you are so smart?" He spat, his face inches from mine, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his stiff silk collar. "You are nothing, Nadia. You are a glorified clerk playing a game you do not understand. You think these agents care about you. I will have you destroyed for this. I will tie you up in litigation until you rot." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked at his sweating red face with nothing but supreme clinical detachment. "I understand the game perfectly, Trent," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I understand exactly how you hid the money, because I was the one tracking every single transfer. Do you remember 3 years ago, Trent? Do you remember that Sunday night you came into the office and mocked me for working late? You told me I was wasting my life at a pathetic administrative job while you were out finalizing million-dollar acquisitions. You laughed in my face and told me to fetch you a coffee like a good little assistant." Trent stared at me, his jaw clenching, his breathing growing ragged. "While you were laughing at my clerk job, I was mirroring your private servers, Trent." I continued, watching the absolute horror slowly dawn in his eyes. "Every single time you logged into your secure terminal to move money into the Cayman Islands, I was watching. Every dime you systematically stole from the employee pension fund has been meticulously documented, tracked, and verified. I have the routing numbers, the timestamp logs, and the false vendor invoices you generated to cover your tracks. You thought you were invisible because you thought I was beneath your notice. That racist, classist arrogance is exactly what built your federal prison cell." Julian collapsed. It was not a figure of speech. His legs simply gave out beneath him and he hit the floor hard, his tailored suit jacket bunching up around his shoulders. The man who had spent years trying to break my spirit, who had threatened to take my daughter and leave me in the gutter, was now on his knees, openly weeping. Real, pathetic tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Nadia. Please," Julian begged, his voice a high-pitched whine that echoed off the glass walls. "Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you made an error in the audit. We can give you whatever you want, Nadia. We can give you the company. Just call them off, please. I cannot go to federal prison." When I did not answer, Julian turned his desperate, tear-streaked face toward Trent. "It was his fault," Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger at his brother-in-law. "Trent forced me to sign those transfer sheets. He told me the pension fund was fully insured and nobody would ever notice the missing capital. He said we needed the liquidity to cover the operational loans. I did not know he was hiding $8 million for himself in the Bahamas. He played all of us, Nadia. He is a thief and a liar." "Shut up, you pathetic coward!" Trent roared, kicking a heavy leather chair out of his way. "You signed those documents because you wanted to keep paying for your country club memberships and your private luxury flights. You knew exactly what we were doing, Julian. You were just too weak and too stupid to figure out how to hide the money properly without me holding your hand." In the far corner of the room, Vanessa was hyperventilating. She had backed herself against the wall, taking short, rapid gasps of air, her manicured hands clutching her chest. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, falling into her face. The reality of federal asset forfeiture was finally penetrating her thick delusion. She looked down at her massive diamond engagement ring, her limited edition designer watch, and her obscenely expensive handbag. She realized in that crushing moment that absolutely none of it belonged to her anymore. The federal government was going to strip her of every single luxury she had used to define her entire existence. The imported cars, the penthouse apartment, the winter vacations, all of it was built on stolen federal money, and all of it was gone. "We have nothing," Vanessa repeated, chanting it like a dark mantra rocking back and forth against the wall. "We have absolutely nothing left." The heavy wooden double doors of the conference room suddenly burst open. The sound was like a gunshot, silencing the screaming men and the hyperventilating women instantly. 6 federal agents marched into the room. They did not look like the polite financial regulators who had visited the historic brownstone on Christmas night. These men and women moved with lethal, aggressive authority, their gold badges displayed prominently on their belts, their hands resting carefully near their tactical holsters. At the front of the group was Special Agent Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite. He held a thick stack of printed warrants in his hand. "Trent Blackwell and Julian Wilson," he announced, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the massive misappropriation of federal pension funds." Trent panicked. The realization that his immense wealth and his overwhelming white privilege offered absolutely zero protection against the federal agent standing in front of him completely broke his mind. He lunged toward the secondary exit door at the back of the conference room, attempting a desperate, pathetic physical escape. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 agents moved with terrifying speed, tackling Trent directly to the carpeted floor. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground was incredibly satisfying to watch. Trent grunted in severe pain as an agent planted a knee firmly into the middle of his back, pulling his arms roughly behind him and snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "Let me go!" Trent shouted, his face pressed deep into the expensive carpet, his voice muffled and desperate. "You cannot do this to me. I have corporate lawyers. I know the mayor of this city." The agents completely ignored his frantic shouting, yanking him up from the floor by his arms. Julian did not try to run or fight. He remained on his knees, sobbing uncontrollably as an agent approached him, pulled his limp arms behind his back, and cuffed him. The sharp, metallic click of the restraints sounded like the final period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. Glee. Special Agent Miller looked around the chaotic room, taking in the weeping, broken men and the terrified, trembling women before his eyes landed squarely on me. I stood perfectly still, my posture flawless, my expression entirely serene. "Officer," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden tense quiet of the room. "These 2 men are the sole signatories on the fraudulent offshore accounts. The complete forensic trail, including the digital transfer authorizations and the hidden Bahamas portfolio, is on the encrypted flash drive I provided to you yesterday morning." "Thank you for your extensive cooperation, Ms. Wilson," Special Agent Miller replied, giving me a curt, professional nod of respect. "Your documentation was exceptionally thorough. We have secured the entire perimeter of this building, and we currently have simultaneous tactical teams executing search warrants at their primary personal residences as we speak." The agents roughly hauled Trent and Julian toward the door. We all filed out of the conference room, heading toward the main bank of elevators. I walked closely behind them, matching my pace to the heavy tactical boots of the federal agents. We rode the elevator down to the main floor in total heavy silence, broken only by the pathetic sound of Julian quietly whimpering. When the elevator doors finally slid open, the true massive scale of their public humiliation became apparent. The massive corporate lobby was completely packed. Hundreds of employees had been corralled into the main atrium by federal marshals, while agents systematically seized computer towers and hauled out heavy boxes of physical financial files. Beyond the towering glass walls of the building, A massive mob of local and national press had already gathered tipped off to the massive corporate raid. News cameras were pressed tightly against the glass reporters holding microphones, waiting eagerly for the perp walk. The agents marched Julian and Trent directly through the absolute center of the lobby. Every single employee watched in stunned, dead silence as their untouchable, arrogant executives were dragged out like common street criminals. Julian kept his head down, his shoulders shaking violently, trying desperately to hide his tear-stained, swollen face from the administrative staff he had spent years terrorizing and belittling. Trent held his head up, attempting to look defiant and angry, but the nervous sweat pouring down his face and the awkward, helpless shuffle of his cuffed hands completely ruined the illusion of power. They were pushed forcefully through the revolving doors and immediately swarmed by the blinding, flashing bulbs of press cameras. The elite social status they prized above basic human decency was being publicly and permanently executed on live national television. Vanessa and Brenda had followed us down in a separate elevator, trailing behind the agents like lost ghosts. As we stood in the center of the chaotic lobby watching the black SUVs pull away with Julian and Trent, Vanessa suddenly snapped. The immediate loss of her husband, her endless money, and her pristine public image shattered her completely. She turned to me, her face contorted with a terrifying mixture of raw grief and venomous, pure hatred. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest, screaming at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the hundreds of shocked employees watching us. "You ruined us!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing loudly off the high marble ceiling. "You planned this from the very beginning. You took everything away from me. Trent is gone. The money is gone. The accounts are frozen solid. Where are we supposed to go, Nadia? Where am I supposed to sleep tonight now that you have destroyed my family?" I looked at Vanessa, feeling a profound, deep sense of closure. She was completely broken, stripped of the thick armor her stolen wealth had provided for so long. I adjusted the leather strap of my briefcase, looking at her and Brenda with total, absolute indifference. "You can go to the brownstone." "Vanessa," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady, cutting effortlessly through her hysterical screaming. "But considering the federal marshals are currently executing a primary asset seizure on the property, you might want to pack quickly." The drive from the downtown corporate district to the historic neighborhood took exactly 22 minutes. I sat in the back of the private luxury town car, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. My phone remained silent. The chaos I had unleashed at the Wilson family headquarters was already dominating the midday news cycle, but my focus had shifted entirely to my final destination. The grand brownstone estate that had served as the physical monument to Brenda Wilson's towering ego was waiting for me. This was the house where I had endured 5 years of thinly veiled insults and overt hostility. This was the house where I was repeatedly reminded of my working-class roots. And this was the house I was about to completely dismantle. As the car pulled onto the quiet, tree-lined street, the scene was exactly as I had orchestrated. 2 massive commercial moving trucks were idling at the curb, taking up the entirety of the pristine brick driveway. A team of professional movers wearing matching gray uniforms was marching up and down the wide stone steps. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. The heavy carved oak front doors were propped wide open, exposing the opulent grand foyer to the freezing winter air. I stepped out of the car, smoothing my tailored wool coat. I walked slowly up the stone steps, listening to the sounds of packing tape tearing and heavy wooden furniture being dragged across the expensive marble floors. Inside, the chaos was absolute. The grand foyer that usually smelled of fresh lilies and expensive floor wax now smelled of cardboard and cold air. A pair of federal marshals stood quietly by the sweeping wooden staircase, holding clipboards and observing the eviction process with bored clinical detachment. In the center of the room, Brenda was completely losing her mind. She was physically trying to block a large burly mover who was carefully carrying a massive silver tea set toward the door. Brenda looked entirely unhinged. Her perfect hair was wild and unkempt. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, and her signature pearl necklace was swinging wildly against her chest as she darted back and forth. "Stop it!" she screamed, waving her hands frantically in the air. "Put that down immediately. You have absolutely no right to touch my things. I am calling the police. I am calling the mayor. Put my silver down." Vanessa was sitting on a sealed cardboard box near the entrance to the dining room. She looked like a hollow, empty shell. The news of Trent's arrest and the total seizure of their corporate assets had completely broken her spirit. She was staring blankly at the floor, shivering in the cold air, wearing a thin designer jacket that offered no protection from the harsh reality she was now facing. She did not even flinch when Brenda shrieked at the movers. She just sat there waiting for the nightmare to end. Brenda spun around wildly and her eyes locked onto me, standing calmly in the doorway. The moment she saw me, her frantic panic instantly hardened into pure toxic vitriol. She marched across the foyer, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She stopped just 2 feet away from me, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You!" She spat, her voice vibrating with hysterical rage. "You did this, Nadia! You sent these thugs into my home! You think you can just barge in here and take everything away from us? You are out of your mind! This house has been in the Wilson family for 3 generations. This is my legacy. You cannot take this house. You do not have the power or the pedigree to stand in this foyer and tell me what to do. I demand you call off these movers right now before I have you thrown in jail for trespassing." I stood perfectly still, letting her furious words wash over me without reacting. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger or resentment. I possessed the supreme calm of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I raised my hand and made a brief silent gesture toward the moving foreman. He immediately blew a short blast on a silver whistle, and his entire crew stopped working. The sudden absolute silence in the grand foyer was deafening. Even the federal marshals looked over, waiting to see what I would do next. I reached into my slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound stack of financial documents. The papers were pristine, filled with dense banking charts and official federal seals. I held the stack out, handing the documents directly to Brenda. "This has not been your legacy for 5 years, Brenda," I stated, my voice perfectly steady and echoing clearly in the quiet room. Brenda frowned, snatching the papers out of my hand with a forceful jerk. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, holding the pages up to the light. "When Julian's father died, he did not leave this house to you free and clear," I explained, watching her eyes scan the first page. "He left this estate in massive, catastrophic debt. He had taken out multiple second mortgages to fund your lavish lifestyle, and when the market crashed, he lost everything. Your precious son Julian discovered the truth the week after the funeral, but Julian did not tell you. He did not tell anyone. He was too terrified of ruining his precious image as the wealthy, successful heir. He knew that if the country club found out the Wilsons were bankrupt, you would be a laughingstock." Brenda's hands began to shake slightly. She was staring at the second page of the document, her eyes widening as she recognized her late husband's signature next to staggering negative balances. "This is a lie," she whispered, her voice losing its aggressive edge. "Arthur would never do this to me. He was a brilliant investor. We are a wealthy family." "You were a wealthy family," I corrected her smoothly. "You have been living on borrowed time and borrowed money since the day Arthur died." When Julian realized the bank was going to foreclose on this brownstone, he panicked. He did not have the liquid cash to save it because he was already sinking the logistics company into the ground. So I stepped in. I found the default notices hidden in his home office. I contacted the primary lender. I used my own personal savings and my corporate consulting bonuses to buy the distressed debt entirely. Brenda flipped to the third page. She saw the endless rows of monthly payment receipts. Every single row was stamped with the word "paid," and next to every single stamp was my name, Nadia Wilson. I have been paying the massive mortgage on this house out of my own salary for 5 straight years. I continued delivering each word with devastating precision. Every time you hosted a lavish charity dinner and mocked my clothes, I was paying the electric bill. Every time you told Vanessa that I was a classless outsider, Dragging this family down, I was writing the check that kept a roof over your arrogant head. You flaunted your generational wealth to my face, Brenda. But the brutal reality is that your entire life of luxury was completely funded by the working-class gutter daughter-in-law you despised so much. The documents slipped from Brenda's trembling hands, scattering across the cold marble floor. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the ground was the sound of her towering ego completely shattering. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her brain to process. The grand illusion she had maintained for decades, the absolute superiority she felt over me, was entirely fabricated. She was not a wealthy matriarch. She was a charity case entirely dependent on my silent labor. Vanessa slowly stood up from the cardboard box. She walked over and stared down at the scattered mortgage receipts. She saw my name printed over and over again. She looked at Brenda, and then she looked at me. Her face a portrait of complete disbelief. "Julian lied to us," Vanessa whispered, her voice hollow and fragile. "He told Trent the house was fully paid off. He used the brownstone as collateral to secure the offshore accounts. If you hold the primary debt, then the federal government cannot touch the physical property." "You are exactly right, Vanessa," I said, giving her a very small, cold smile. "The federal marshals are here to seize the assets inside the house because they were purchased with stolen pension funds. But the house itself, the brick and the mortar, belongs entirely to me." Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a low, guttural sob. Her knees buckled slightly and she leaned heavily against the mahogany banister for support. "You own the house," she gasped, staring at me with a mixture of terror and revulsion. "You own my home." I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Do you remember Christmas night?" "Brenda," I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper. "Do you remember standing in this exact spot, telling me that I was a liability? Do you remember telling Julian that you would not allow me to sleep under your roof ever again?" Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, tears spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her perfect makeup. "Please, Nadia," she wept, begging for the first time in her life. "Please do not do this. I am an old woman. I have nowhere else to go. All my friends live in this neighborhood. I will apologize. I will do whatever you want. Just let me stay in my home." "It is not your home," I stated without a single ounce of pity. "When you told me to leave on Christmas night, I walked out that door and I made a phone call. I contacted the bank the very next morning and I stopped the auto draft payments. I deliberately defaulted on the loan that I owned. I legally foreclosed on this property at 9 o'clock this morning. The paperwork was expedited because the federal authorities needed the property cleared to execute their own seizure mandates." I turned away from her and looked out the large front windows toward the snowy street. "I did not keep the house, Brenda. I have absolutely no desire to live in a monument to your miserable family. I already sold it to a commercial developer. They are going to completely gut the interior next week and turn your historic family legacy into luxury condominiums." Brenda let out a loud, piercing scream of pure anguish and collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying her face in her hands. She cried for the house, she cried for her status, and she cried for the devastating humiliation of knowing she had been destroyed by the very person she thought she was superior to. I signaled the moving foreman again. He blew his whistle, and the crew immediately resumed packing up the remnants of the Wilson family dignity. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the propped open front doors, the crisp winter air feeling incredibly refreshing against my skin. I stopped at the threshold and looked back over my shoulder at the sobbing, broken women sitting among the cardboard boxes. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property," I said, stepping out into the cold and walking down the steps toward my waiting car. The freezing Chicago wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the wealthy suburban street. I stood at the bottom of the wide stone steps, wrapping my tailored wool coat tightly around my shoulders. The air tasted crisp and sharp, carrying the distinct scent of impending snow and absolute total victory. Behind me, the heavy footsteps of the commercial moving crew echoed continuously from inside the historic brownstone. They were hauling out the final remnants of the Wilson family dignity, packing Brenda Wilson's priceless antiques and Persian rugs into the dark, cavernous bellies of the idling moving trucks. The heavy thud of boxes being stacked was the perfect background music for the scene unfolding right in front of me on the pristine brick driveway. Vanessa was standing at the rear of her gleaming white Porsche Cayenne, fighting desperately with the heavy automatic trunk. The luxury SUV was the ultimate symbol of her perceived superiority. It was the chariot she used to drive to her exclusive country club luncheons and her high-end charity galas, where she would whisper cruel jokes about my working-class background to her wealthy friends. Now she was using it as a life raft. She was frantically shoving massive matching Louis Vuitton suitcases into the back cargo area. Her perfectly styled hair was blowing wildly in the wind, and her expensive manicured nails were catching and tearing on the heavy brass zippers of her designer luggage. She was panting heavily, her breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing winter air. She stopped shoving a particularly oversized garment bag and turned her head. Her eyes locked onto me, standing calmly on the pavement. The sheer physical exertion and the biting cold had turned her face a blotchy, uneven red, but her eyes still held that familiar, toxic arrogance. She slammed the heavy trunk shut, the sound echoing sharply down the quiet street, and leaned her back against the pristine white paint of the expensive vehicle. "You think you have won this little game, Nadia?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom and desperate bravado. "You think coming here and taking this house makes you better than us? You are just a bitter, vindictive woman who got incredibly lucky with some accounting software. I am still a Blackwell. I still have a name that demands respect in every important circle in this city. You can steal the logistics company and you can take my mother-in-law's house, but you cannot touch my future. I am going to divorce Trent the very second he gets out on bail. My lawyers are already drafting the paperwork. I will take half of everything he hid in those offshore accounts. I know exactly where the money is, Nadia. I know about the accounts in the Bahamas. I will take his millions and I will buy a massive penthouse downtown, and I will still be infinitely richer and better than you will ever be." I stood on the snowy pavement just watching her. It was genuinely fascinating to witness the sheer staggering depth of her delusion. She actually believed the money was still sitting there, waiting for her to claim it. She actually believed her social status was an invisible shield that could somehow deflect federal law and corporate liquidation. Before I could even begin to dismantle her pathetic fantasy, the heavy grinding sound of a massive diesel engine interrupted our conversation. A large, battered commercial tow truck pulled aggressively into the brick driveway, stopping just inches from the rear bumper of the white Porsche, completely blocking the vehicle from leaving. The truck was painted a dull industrial yellow, its heavy metal chains rattling loudly as it idled. Two massive men, wearing thick canvas work jackets and heavy leather gloves, stepped out of the cab. The driver, a tall man with a thick gray beard, walked straight toward the Porsche, holding a battered metal clipboard. "Excuse me," Vanessa demanded, stepping away from her car and crossing her arms over her expensive designer coat. "You cannot park that ugly thing here. Move it right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The driver did not even blink at her aggressive, demanding tone. He looked down at his clipboard, reading the paperwork, and then looked up at the license plate of the white Porsche. "Are you Vanessa Blackwell?" he asked, his voice completely flat and entirely devoid of the respect she demanded. "Yes, I am," Vanessa replied, lifting her chin and adopting her most elitist condescending posture. "And you are trespassing on private property." The driver held out the clipboard, pushing it directly toward her chest. "I am not trespassing, lady," he said, pulling a heavy set of metallic keys from his thick jacket pocket. "I am executing a commercial asset repossession. This specific vehicle is registered to the Wilson Family Logistics Corporation under an executive corporate lease agreement. The primary leasing agency was notified of the corporate dissolution and federal seizure an hour ago. This vehicle is officially listed for immediate repossession and liquidation. Hand over the keys right now." Vanessa stared at the metal clipboard, as if the words printed on the paper were written in an alien language. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. She looked at me, her eyes wide with sudden rising panic, realizing exactly what was happening. "You cannot do this," Vanessa shrieked, stepping backward and pressing her body protectively against the driver's side door. "This is my personal car. Trent bought this for me for our 5th wedding anniversary. It belongs to me. It does not belong to you or your company." "It does not belong to you, Vanessa," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, my boots crunching softly on the fresh snow. "It never belonged to you. Trent leased that vehicle using a secure corporate expense account. He used company funds to pay the massive monthly premiums because he was too cheap and too heavily in debt to buy it with his own personal money. And since I am now the sole owner and chief executive officer of the corporate entity that holds the lease, I ordered the immediate liquidation of all non-essential company vehicles. That includes your precious anniversary present. Give the man the keys, Vanessa. You are officially walking." "No." Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing shrilly down the quiet, wealthy street. "I need this car. All my clothes and my bags are inside. I'm leaving right now. You cannot take my car." The second repo man walked around to the back of the SUV and effortlessly popped the trunk using a master override tool. He began grabbing the heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases and tossing them carelessly onto the wet, snowy driveway. The expensive designer leather slapped heavily against the frozen concrete, scuffing and scratching upon impact. "Hey! Stop doing that!" Vanessa shrieked, lunging toward the back of the car and trying to grab the men. "Those bags are worth more than your miserable life." The driver stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path with his massive frame. "Lady, give me the keys right now, or I am calling the local precinct and having you arrested for interfering with a commercial repossession order," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive growl. Vanessa was trembling violently, her entire body shaking from the cold and the shock. She slowly reached into her designer coat pocket and pulled out the gleaming electronic key fob. She dropped it into the driver's thick gloved hand, as if the plastic were burning her skin. She watched in absolute silent horror as the driver climbed into her pristine white Porsche, started the powerful engine, and drove it slowly up the steep metal ramp of the flatbed tow truck. The heavy steel chains clanked and locked firmly into place, securing the luxury vehicle. The tow truck idled loudly, throwing thick black exhaust into the freezing air before pulling backward out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. Vanessa stood completely alone on the frozen concrete, surrounded by her expensive luxury luggage scattered haphazardly in the snow. She looked entirely broken. Her shoulders were slumped forward and her chest was heaving with deep, ragged, breathless sobs. "I still have the offshore money," she whispered, her voice cracking and desperate, sounding like a frightened child clinging to a broken toy. "I will hire the absolute best divorce attorneys in the entire country. I will take half of what Trent hid in the Bahamas. I will survive this, Nadia." "You will not survive anything, Vanessa," I said, my words cutting through the freezing air like a surgical razor blade. "There is no offshore money. There is no hidden fortune waiting to save you and fund your penthouse dreams. Trent's accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas were completely frozen by the Department of the Treasury at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. Every single dime of that $14 million has been formally seized by the federal government to repay the stolen employee pension funds. Furthermore, any remaining personal liquid assets Trent possessed are currently being seized to pay massive federal fines and mandated restitution. Trent is completely bankrupt, Vanessa. He is turning state's evidence against your brother Julian, just to shave a few miserable years off his upcoming federal prison sentence. You cannot take half of his money because half of zero is still exactly zero. You are completely, entirely, and irrevocably penniless." The sheer crushing weight of her new reality finally broke through the very last remaining walls of her protective delusion. Vanessa let out a sound that was barely human. It was a high-pitched, keening wail of pure, profound, absolute despair. Her legs simply gave out beneath her and she dropped straight down onto the frozen pavement. Her knees hit the hard concrete with a sickening thud, but she did not even seem to feel the physical pain. She collapsed forward, burying her tear-streaked face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably among her scattered snow-covered designer bags. Her entire identity, her carefully constructed social status, her immense arrogant pride had been completely erased from existence in a matter of minutes. She was no longer a wealthy, powerful socialite looking down on the world. She was a broke, unemployed woman sitting in the freezing snow, crying over luggage she could no longer even carry. I stood watching her for a long moment, feeling absolutely no pity or remorse. She had actively chosen to be cruel. She had actively chosen to participate in my daily torment. Now she was simply paying the bill for her behavior. I turned my attention away from the sobbing broken woman on the ground and looked up at the towering stone steps of the grand estate. Brenda Wilson was standing at the very top of the stairs. She was wearing a heavy, dark wool coat over her wrinkled, unkempt clothes, clutching a small tapestry overnight bag tightly to her chest. Behind her, the commercial moving crew was carrying out the very last of the sealed brown boxes. Two federal marshals were standing by the heavy oak front doors, using industrial power drills to secure thick sheets of plywood over the beautiful stained glass windows and attaching heavy iron padlocks to the main entryways. The house was being officially boarded up and sealed. The historic legacy she had constantly bragged about, the generational wealth she had wielded like a weapon, was being literally locked away from her forever. Brenda watched the heavy wooden doors slam shut with a final echoing boom. She watched the thick steel padlocks click firmly into place. Then she slowly turned her head and looked down the long flight of steps at the driveway below. She saw her golden child Vanessa kneeling in the freezing snow, weeping uncontrollably next to her ruined luggage. She saw the vast empty space on the brick pavement where the luxury cars used to be parked. She saw the massive moving trucks pulling away from the curb, taking absolutely everything she owned to an anonymous federal holding facility. And then she looked directly at me, the formidable matriarch of the Wilson family. The woman who had spent 5 long years trying to make me feel small, inadequate, and insignificant, slowly began to walk down the stone steps. Her movements were stiff, awkward, and incredibly labored. She looked unbelievably old and incredibly frail. The towering aristocratic pride that had defined her entire existence was entirely gone. The arrogant, superior fire in her eyes had been totally extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, dark, empty ashes. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped just a few feet away from me. The winter wind whipped around us, blowing loose powder snow across the brick driveway. Brenda looked at me, her face completely pale and drawn, her thin lips trembling violently. She slowly lowered her tapestry overnight bag to the snowy ground. Then, in a movement that shocked even me, the great Brenda Wilson slowly bent her knees and dropped down onto the frozen concrete. She knelt on the ground, right next to the scattered designer bags and the weeping form of her daughter. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with absolute crushing total defeat. "Please, Nadia." Brenda whispered, her voice rough and broken, pleading from the very bottom of her completely shattered soul. "Please, I have nowhere to go. I am sorry." The sound of the word sorry hanging in the freezing air felt completely surreal. I stood there looking down at the woman who had terrorized me for half a decade. Brenda Wilson, the undisputed queen of her superficial high society world, was kneeling on the frozen concrete of her own driveway. Her expensive wool coat was soaking up the dirty melted snow from the pavement. The tapestry bag containing whatever pathetic scraps she had managed to grab from her seized estate sat discarded by her knees. Behind her, Vanessa was still gasping for air among her ruined luggage, completely useless, completely broken. I stared down at Brenda and searched myself for a single trace of empathy. I waited to see if the sight of an elderly woman begging in the freezing cold would trigger some deep-seated maternal instinct or basic human compassion. It did not. I felt absolutely nothing but the crisp bite of the winter wind against my cheeks. The apology was utterly meaningless. It was not born out of genuine remorse or a sudden realization of her cruelty. It was born out of pure, unadulterated desperation. She was only sorry because she had lost. She was only sorry because the weapon she had used to bludgeon me for years, her wealth, had been violently stripped away, leaving her completely defenseless. Brenda saw the cold indifference in my eyes, and the panic on her face deepened. The fragile facade of a simple apology cracked, and she immediately pivoted to her lifelong defense mechanism: manipulation. She reached a shaking hand toward the hem of my coat, but I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring she could not touch me. "Nadia, please, you have to listen to me," Brenda pleaded, her voice taking on a frantic theatrical quality. "I am an old woman. You cannot leave me out here in the cold. It is not Christian. It is not right. We are family. God sees everything, Nadia. He knows we have had our differences, but He commands us to forgive. You are a good person. You are a kind girl from a good, hard-working background. I see that now. I was blind before, but I see it now. You cannot throw your own family into the street. It goes against everything you are." I let out a short, hollow laugh that carried absolutely no humor. It was fascinating watching her try to weaponize my own morality against me. She was actually trying to use the very same working-class background she had endlessly mocked as a reason why I should be merciful. When that failed to produce a reaction, her eyes darted frantically around the driveway, searching for another angle. Then she played her final desperate card. "Think of Arya!" She cried out, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "Think of your beautiful daughter Nadia, my granddaughter. She needs her grandmother in her life. You cannot take a child's family away from her. How will you explain this to her when she grows up? How will you tell her that you left her grandmother to freeze in the street? Please, for Arya's sake, give me another chance. Let me show you I can be the grandmother she deserves. I will be better. I swear to you on my life I will be better." The mention of my daughter's name coming from her mouth sent a spike of pure white-hot anger straight through my chest. The absolute audacity of this woman was staggering. For 5 years, she had treated Arya like an inconvenience, a loud, messy byproduct of Julian marrying beneath his station. She had constantly criticized my parenting. She had bought Arya wildly inappropriate, extravagant gifts just to undermine my authority. And she had openly lamented that Arya did not look enough like the Wilsons. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until I was looking directly down into her tear-filled eyes. My shadow fell over her face, blocking out the pale winter sun. "Do not ever speak my daughter's name again," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "You do not get to use her as a human shield, Brenda. You do not get to invoke a relationship you never cared to build. You have never been a grandmother to Arya. You have been a critic, a judge, and a tyrant. You tolerated her existence because she shared a fraction of your genetics, but you never loved her. And you certainly never loved me." Brenda let out a ragged gasp, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth. She was physically trembling now, shivering from the cold concrete and the crushing realization that none of her tricks were working. "Let me refresh your memory, Brenda." I continued, my words falling with the steady rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. "Let us go back to Christmas dinner, just a few short months ago. Do you remember the absolute delight on your face when Julian demanded that I apologize to Vanessa for a slight I did not even commit? When Julian told me to apologize or leave you," smiled Brenda. "I saw it. I saw the profound toxic joy radiating from your face. You thought you had finally won. You thought you had finally broken the poor little working-class girl. You thought because I did not scream or fight back or throw a tantrum that I was weak. You mistook my silence for submission." I paused, letting the cold wind howl around us, giving my words time to sink deep into her fractured mind. "You thought true power was defined by the size of your trust fund and the brand of your crystal glassware," I said, gesturing toward the boarded-up brownstone behind her. "You thought power was raising your voice at waiters and threatening to ruin people who inconvenienced you. But you were wrong. Real power is quiet. Real power is watching your enemies hand you the exact weapons you need to destroy them. Real power is sitting at a dining table enduring your pathetic insults while systematically dismantling your entire empire behind your back." I did not need to scream Brenda because I was already holding the deed to your house. Brenda was weeping openly now, her shoulders shaking violently. She reached out again, her gloved hands grasping at the empty air between us. Nadia, please, I am begging you. I have no money. The bank accounts are all frozen. The credit cards are declined. My friends are not answering their phones. They saw the news about Julian and Trent. Nobody wants to be associated with a federal indictment. I am completely alone. Where am I supposed to go? I looked down at her, feeling the final piece of the puzzle lock perfectly into place. The revenge was absolute. The extraction was complete. I do not want your apology, Brenda, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion whatsoever. It is entirely empty. You are not sorry for the way you treated me. You are only sorry that the person you spent years stepping on is now the person holding the keys to your survival. You only respect power, Brenda, and now that I hold all of it, you are on your knees in the snow. But it is too late. The transaction is over. I took a deliberate step back, breaking the invisible tether between us. Go find a shelter, Brenda, I stated smoothly. There are several very good city-funded facilities downtown. I am sure you can take a public bus to get there. It will be a wonderful opportunity for you to experience how the other half lives. But you cannot stay here. You are trespassing on private property owned by my corporate holding firm. And frankly, Brenda, you are simply socially unfit to be in my presence. The words landed with absolute devastating finality. It was the exact phrase she had used to describe me to her country club friends years ago. Hearing it turned back on her, delivered with total cold detachment, completely shattered her. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the icy concrete, letting out a long, low wail of absolute defeat. She had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more threats to make. The great Brenda Wilson was reduced to a crying heap in the snow. I did not wait for her to lift her head. I turned my back on her and on the weeping Vanessa and walked away. I walked down the remainder of the driveway, my posture perfectly straight, my breathing steady and calm. A sleek black luxury SUV was idling at the curb. The tinted windows hid the interior, offering a promise of warmth and total privacy. As I approached my private chauffeur, a man I had hired just yesterday stepped out quickly. He was dressed in a sharp black suit and a flat cap. He gave me a respectful nod and opened the heavy rear door for me. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, slipping into the spacious heated leather interior of the vehicle. "Where to?" Ms. Wilson Marcus asked, closing the door firmly behind me, shutting out the sounds of the freezing wind and the crying women. "Take me back to the corporate office, Marcus," I replied, settling into the plush leather seat and unbuttoning my coat. "We have a lot of work to do this afternoon." He nodded, sliding into the driver's seat and putting the large SUV into gear. The vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding down the pristine suburban street. I did not look out the rear window. I did not need a final glimpse of the destruction I had caused. The chapter was closed. The house was gone. The villains were broken and discarded. The future was completely, entirely mine. As we merged onto the main highway, heading back toward the towering glass skyline of downtown Chicago, the silence in the back of the SUV was profound and peaceful. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the tension of the last 5 years finally drain out of my muscles. It was over. I had protected my daughter, I had secured my financial future, and I had delivered absolute precise justice. Suddenly, the sharp buzzing of my cell phone shattered the quiet interior of the car. I opened my eyes and pulled the device from my purse. The caller ID displayed a restricted federal government number. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of professional confidence. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. "Nadia Wilson speaking," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "Miss Wilson. This is United States Attorney Robert Vance calling from the federal prosecutor's office." The voice on the other end was deep, gravelly, and entirely serious. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vance," I replied, watching the city skyline grow larger through the tinted windows. "I assume you are calling regarding the massive asset seizures and the arrests of Julian Wilson and Trent Blackwell." "That is correct, Miss Wilson," the prosecutor replied. "Your forensic accounting work was extraordinary. The flash drive you provided gave us everything we needed to execute a flawless multi-agency sweep. We have completely frozen $14 million in offshore accounts, and we have enough documentary evidence to put both men away for a very long time." Frankly, I have never seen a civilian audit put together with such lethal precision. I am glad I could be of assistance to the federal government, I said smoothly, resting my hand on my leather briefcase. That brings me to the reason for this call, Ms. Wilson, the prosecutor continued. We have a massive amount of corporate restructuring and financial untangling to do over the next 2 years. We are seizing dozens of shell companies, shell accounts, and physical assets. We need someone who understands the internal architecture of this specific type of corporate fraud. We need an expert. I listened silently, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. The federal government would like to offer you a primary consulting contract, Ms. Wilson. We want you to oversee the total liquidation and redistribution of the Wilson Family Logistics Corporation assets. It is a massive undertaking, and the contract is highly lucrative. We are prepared to offer you full autonomy over the project under federal oversight. We need your mind on our side. Are you interested? I looked out the window, watching the reflection of the city passing by. I thought about the cramped little desk I used to occupy. I thought about the years of fetching coffee and enduring insults. And then I thought about the empire I had just built from the ashes of their arrogance. Mr. Vance, I said, a slow, genuine smile finally spreading across my face. I would be absolutely delighted to accept your offer. Send the contract over to my legal team this afternoon. We have an empire to liquidate. The next 6 months were a blur of absolute systematic dismantling. I worked directly alongside the federal prosecutors and government auditors, ripping through the tangled, hopelessly corrupt web of the Wilson family accounts. It was surgical, relentless work. We liquidated shell companies, we auctioned off massive commercial transport fleets, and we aggressively clawed back every single stolen dollar to restore the depleted employee pension funds. Julian and Trent had spent their entire privileged lives believing they were the untouchable architects of a grand financial dynasty. It took me exactly 180 days to burn their stolen dynasty to the ground and scatter the ashes to the winter wind. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse apartment, overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. The warm golden light spilled across the wide plank hardwood floors and illuminated the sleek, minimalist modern furniture. There were no heavy, oppressive mahogany antiques here. There were no dark, suffocating oil paintings staring down from the walls, judging me. The air in this home was clean and bright, and it smelled of fresh espresso and absolute total freedom. I stood at the expansive white marble kitchen island holding a sleek gold pen. My personal attorney Marcus slid the final stack of thick legal documents across the smooth stone surface. He did not say a word, simply tapping his index finger next to the signature line on the very last page. I looked down at the final divorce decree. Julian had completely folded. He had no money left to pay his elite defense attorneys, let alone fund a prolonged, vicious custody battle. He had signed away absolutely everything. I gripped the gold pen and signed my name with swift, fluid, confident strokes. It was done. The heavy, suffocating chain linking me to that toxic family was permanently severed. I was officially granted 100% sole legal and physical custody of Aria. Julian was stripped of all visitation rights, deemed a severe flight risk, and a convicted federal felon. He was completely permanently erased from our lives. I handed the pen back to Marcus, feeling a massive physical weight lift from my shoulders. In the spacious, sunlit living room behind me, the massive flat-screen television was murmuring quietly with the morning financial news broadcast. I walked over and picked up the remote, raising the volume just as the anchor transitioned to the top local story. The screen flashed with the unmistakable official seals of the federal court system. Julian Wilson and Trent Blackwell had just faced their final sentencing hearing. The polished female anchor read the verdict with crisp, professional detachment. 15 years. They had both been sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. The news station immediately displayed their official booking photographs. Julian looked completely hollowed out. His face was pale and gaunt, his perfectly styled hair now flat and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the camera like a dead man walking. But Trent was the true masterpiece of the broadcast. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy of the Chicago financial district was openly sobbing in his mugshot. His face was blotchy and bloated, his eyes swollen, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. The crushing reality of spending the next decade and a half in a tiny concrete cell surrounded by men he used to casually exploit had completely broken his mind. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, letting the sweet taste of absolute justice wash over me. The broadcast moved on to the weather, but I already knew the pathetic fate of the remaining Blackwell and Wilson women. My private investigator had provided a highly detailed final report just last week, confirming everything. Vanessa had been completely blacklisted by every single one of her former high society friends. The moment the federal indictments dropped and her assets were seized, her country club memberships were revoked, and her phone instantly stopped ringing. Without Trent's stolen millions to hide behind, she was forced into the only job that would hire a woman with absolutely zero practical skills and a deeply toxic public reputation. She was currently working as a part-time cashier at a brightly lit massive discount retail store in the dreary outer suburbs. She spent her long, miserable days standing on cheap linoleum, wearing an ugly, scratchy polyester uniform vest, scanning cheap plastic toys, and bagging discounted groceries. She was forced to smile and provide customer service to the exact same working-class people she used to openly mock and despise. Her socialite days were permanently replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of minimum wage and sore feet. Brenda had suffered a fate arguably worse than death for a woman of her profound, staggering arrogance. After I legally foreclosed on the historic brownstone and the federal government seized all of her hidden offshore liquid assets, she was left entirely destitute. She was currently living in a cramped, dark, low-income subsidized apartment building on the far south side of the city. There were no crystal chandeliers hanging from vaulted ceilings, and no antique silver tea sets displayed on polished sideboards. There was only a tiny stained laminate kitchen countertop and the deafening constant noise of sirens and city traffic outside her thin single-pane windows. She spent her lonely days sitting in a worn second-hand armchair staring at peeling wallpaper, utterly alone, feeding on nothing but her own bitter, faded memories. Her glorious family legacy, the pedigree she wielded like a weapon against me, was completely, entirely dead. The joyful sound of small, bare feet pattering rapidly across the hardwood floor pulled me out of my thoughts. Arya came running into the sunlit living room, her bright eyes shining with pure, unadulterated joy. She was wearing a comfortable, oversized sweater, and her hair was pulled back into a messy, happy ponytail. The nervous, anxious shadow that used to hang over her when we lived under the crushing weight of the Wilson family expectations was completely gone. She was vibrant and thriving. She crashed into my legs, throwing her small arms tightly around my waist. "Look, Mommy!" she squealed, holding up a piece of brightly colored construction paper. I drew a picture of our new house. I knelt down and took the drawing from her small hands. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess of bright yellow suns and tall blue buildings with two smiling stick figures standing right in the middle holding hands. It was absolutely perfect. I pulled her tightly against my chest, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I love it, baby," I whispered, kissing the top of her head, feeling a fierce, overwhelming surge of protective love. "It is the most beautiful picture in the whole world." The soft chime of the private elevator doors opening echoed through the grand foyer. My new executive assistant, a sharp, brilliant woman named Claire, walked into the apartment carrying a thick black leather portfolio. "Good morning, Nadia," she said, offering a warm, professional smile. "I have the final briefs prepared for the morning strategy meeting." The newly launched independent risk management firm was a massive, overwhelming success. After my high-profile, highly publicized work dismantling the Wilson corporate fraud, the market demand for my specific forensic accounting skills had absolutely skyrocketed. I had brilliantly leveraged the initial federal consulting contract into building my own elite private agency. The thick portfolio Claire handed me was filled to the brim with lucrative long-term contracts from Fortune 500 companies, desperate to hire my specialized team to audit their internal corporate structures. I was no longer a glorified clerk fetching coffee for arrogant, mediocre men. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife enduring insults at a hostile dinner table. I was the founder and chief executive officer of the most powerful and sought-after risk management firm in the entire Midwest. I stood by the massive glass window sipping my hot coffee. I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored dark navy suit that fit me perfectly, radiating quiet, absolute authority. I looked out over the sprawling city of Chicago, the bright morning sun glinting brilliantly off the towering steel and glass skyscrapers. I was completely unburdened. The heavy, suffocating chains of my past had been totally shattered. I did not just survive their incredible cruelty and their toxic, relentless abuse. I used their arrogance, their blind entitlement, and their staggering criminal greed as the very foundation to build my own untouchable empire. They had handed me the bricks to build my castle when they thought they were throwing stones to break me. I smiled a deep, genuine expression of total, absolute peace. I hugged my daughter one last time, letting her bright, happy laughter fill the room, and then turned toward the heavy oak doors of my private home office. I handed my empty coffee mug to Claire, grabbed my heavy leather portfolio, and walked confidently into my new boardroom to lead the morning meeting. Fade to black. The greatest lesson from this story is that true power never comes from inherited wealth or belittling others. It comes from silent resilience, hard work, and the courage to build your own success. When toxic people mistake your quiet patience for weakness, let your final results speak louder than their cruelest insults. You never have to seek revenge when natural consequences and your own brilliant success will eventually do the talking for you. If you have ever walked away from a toxic environment to build your own empire, share your journey in the comments below. Please like and subscribe for more stories of justice and personal triumph.